I'd like to share with you today is something that I wrote for my epistemology class. It is La psychiatrie s'agit-elle d'une science qui déhumanise? And I actually translated it into English because it's a subject that's important to me. So I'm really happy with the feedback that I got, but I'll share that with you after I finish this when I get home.
Hi, I'm home, and if you're new here, my name is Wani, and I am a philosophy student at Sorbonne. I will just start off by reading my tutor's note to me about my paper. So he said, Bonsoir, j'ai lu votre mémoire d'épistémologie, 18. I'm so happy. I mean, I was, and I still am so happy. Excellent reflection. Oh wait, French. Excellente réflexion originale et intelligemment critique à l'égard de l'institution psychiatrique. Bonne utilisation des philosophes classiques, Hegel, Spinoza, Aristote. Quelques passages particulièrement stimulants sur le suicide et le problème de l'agentivité, sur la pseudo-liberté à la fin. Attention, Martha Nussbaum est une femme. Bien à vous. And then his sign off. I know that Martha's, like, Nussbaum is a woman. It's just like, whatever. I mean, when you're, okay, no excuses, but I wrote him back. I was just like, thank you for like giving us the opportunity to write this paper that is like personal but also pertinent. And I know that Nussbaum is a woman. It's a typo, but whatever. I guess we'll move on. And that's probably why you didn't give me a 20, whatever. So yeah, I basically decided to do this here just because I listened back to the audio, and I will leave you with the introduction in Paris because I think it's beautiful, and also like it kind of gives you the mood of what it means to live in society, which is where my paper begins. And yeah, I'll see you back here after you listen to my introduction.
Let us begin. Oh, and we're out right now, so there's gonna be people walking by. But let's go. We can talk about the good health of Van Gogh. It is a man who preferred to become crazy. Merci. It is a man who preferred to become crazy in the sense that we mean socially, than to forfeit a certain superior idea of human honor. From his writings in Van Gogh, the man suicided by society, Antonin Artaud, a man who has been subjected to electroshocks and who has spent the last years of his life in psychiatric asylums, defends the actions of Van Gogh, a man who has committed suicide only 2 years after committing self-mutilation. How are we to understand this paradoxical claim of the good health of a man who has committed suicide? Or is there no paradox at all, as we come to realize that we are attempting to make sense of, that is, to find reason behind the words of a man who himself was clinically diagnosed with insanity? For even if Artaud was bestowed with the cult title of the cult title of the crazy genius, this genius is nonetheless of the same insanity, of paranoia, of a denial of reality, and ultimately of irrationality. In this way, these words ought to be disqualified. And yet, what is it that legitimizes this disqualification? How do we as a society decisively dismiss the value of the discourse of an individual? Artaud's essay postulates that present life is, in this ancient atmosphere of stupor, of anarchy, of disorder, of delirium, of deregulation, of chronic madness, of bourgeois inertia, of psychic anomaly, because it is not man but the world that has become amoral. It is in this way that the crazed society invented psychiatry to defend itself from investigations of a certain superior lucidities, which faculties of divination unsettles it. Yes. In other words, we see the emergence of a science that strips a person of their societal value to maintain the violent irrationality that is the order of the norm. We see psychiatry and its use of clinical diagnosis. To retrace how the disqualification of an individual from society is legitimized through the diagnostic process of psychiatry, we seek to address three principal questions. Firstly, what is human suffering? Secondly, how does psychiatry as a practice or inexact science approach the suffering? And finally, what are the consequences of being diagnosed as one who suffers, i.e., to be labeled a patient? And by extension, how this change in social status relates intrinsically to the devaluation of human life, i.e., its dehumanization. So, what is
human suffering? Any form of participation in society requires some form of sacrifice. This alludes to the three dissenters in Hegel's The Phenomenology of Spirit 1807. why there are three principal ways in which an individual confronts the way of the world or law of society: as jouisseur, with an immediate identification between law and one's law of heart, but which leads to one's eventual self-destruction; as a terrorist, number two, I didn't write number two, but terrorist, through the denunciation of the law and therefore self-alienation; or as an idealist, where one is regulated to nothing more than a passive witness through recognizing the dissonance between one's own nature and the current perverted surface of society. The uniting difference between these three modes of participation is that all sacrifice, self-destruction, self-alienation, or total passivity results from an individual's attempt at adaptation. Adapting is the appropriation made by an organism to accomplish a vital function, i.e. acquiring food or shelter in its given context. In this way, sacrifice occurs when we adapt or appropriate ourselves to society in order to satisfy our vital needs. Successful appropriation involves the modification of the psychic functions of the individual that, without an alteration of their nature, manages to live in harmony with their continually evolving milieu. Here we run into a dilemma. How can there be a modification to one's psychic function without an alteration to one's nature? How is it possible to remain oneself while at the same time adapting, i.e. sacrificing oneself, in hopes of seeking harmony with one's external surroundings? In short, how is it possible to successfully adapt? To live in society is not as simple as the direct satisfaction of one's basic human needs of food and shelter. For if one is to live, one is expected to work. One works to pay for these basic needs, whose access is granted and regulated by other individuals within society. Working in society is therefore not one's isolated mode of functioning, but it is one's function in relation to other individuals in society. In Chapter 7 of the Fourth Ethics, Spinoza affirms that, and it cannot be said that man is not part of nature, and does not follow nature's common order. On the contrary, if he finds himself in the midst of things that do not at all accord with his nature, he will hardly be able to adapt to them without a great mutation to himself. Here we understand that a great mutation occurs when one's nature is contested, as one attempts to adapt, by those in one's surroundings. Therefore, can it be said that this great change is the cause of human suffering, i.e. the cause of physical, psychic, or moral pain? And if so, how does human suffering in these terms concretely manifest in an individual of society? To adapt to one's surroundings, one must be both sensitive to its demands and efficient in answering them. In Language and Symbolic Power, Bourdieu conceives every individual as a corporal hexis that the body is. Oh my god, I misspelled Bourdieu. This is why I lost 2 points. Oh my god. Okay. And we're back. Conceives every individual as a corporal hexis that the body is a political mythology, realized, incorporated, made permanent, a lasting way of speaking and walking, and thus thinking and feeling. In other words, the way we function or behave is a direct result of the way we adapt to multiple markets that make up our surroundings. If you want to know more about markets, I talk about it in this video. Adapting in this sense is the aim of maintaining one's value in society or one's acceptability. And in this video, I talk a bit about that. This corporal tension between one's awareness of one's level of acceptance and the internalization of the rules and demands of the market can be analyzed through the manifestation of timidity. If an individual possesses la fondation de la certitude sui, that is, certainty itself of the likeliness of the positive sanctions, and therefore an improvement in their acceptability and stature in society, the outcome is that of an individual of assurance. However, if the individual is in anticipation of negative sanctions or penalties for their actions, what results is an individual's condemnation to resignation and silence through all forms of insecurity and shyness or timidity. Here we see how the threat of loss of one's level of acceptance produces a type of anticipation or fear of negative results that leads to an effective modification of an individual's behavior, otherwise known as social conditioning. In search of the definition of human suffering, we have traced thus far the consequences of societal adaptation through its multiple conceptions, that of sacrifice to work as societal function, and finally to the physical manifestation of the great mutation in the form of social conditioning. However, can we truly adequate this fear of unacceptability to human suffering? For psychiatry does not lend itself to treating the timid. It claims not to remediate the consequences of one's social conditioning, that is, the threat to one's level of acceptability. Psychiatry claims, however, to address the threat to one's proper agency, i.e. one's capacity to function independently in society. Part 2. How does psychiatry as a practice or an exact science approach human suffering? What psychiatry treats as human suffering is not the effects of social adaptation, but the effects of our incapacity to do so, i.e. our incapacity to adapt, which leads to the loss of our proper agency. Our agency is our capacity to act on others and the world as measured by our own experiences and perceptions of it. In this way, the mutation caused due to adaptation is not considered human suffering as long as the individual continues to function independently within society. In the Specificity of Public Psychiatry, published by the French Ministry of Health, this is literally an official document, it is cited that Henry I, the father of modern French psychiatry, describes the practice of psychiatry as a pathology of freedom. This conception is said to be inspired by Canguilhem's conception of health as not of passive adaptation, but that of the creation of new norms that opposes the conditioning of thought and behavior. Human suffering is therefore not when an individual is unable to adapt, with sad modifications to their nature, but when an individual is imprisoned by their resistance to adopting new norms that would allow them to actively do so. Psychiatry, therefore, is a practice of active reconditioning an individual in hopes of rendering them fit to function in society. However, what is problematic with this approach is that psychiatry itself is an inexact science. Unlike exact sciences such as biomedicine or neuroscience, psychiatry is inseparable from its social, cultural, and political surroundings. In this way, how can psychiatry claim that its practice of reconditioning is anything other than further social conditioning? In other words, is psychiatry's intervention therefore not simply further modification that goes against the very nature of the treated individual under the guise of freedom? Or does this freedom apply not so much the freedom from social determinations, but the freedom to function according to the demands of society without resistance from the individual? The exceptional moment for involuntary psychiatric, this apartment, like, I have a heater right next to me, and I mention it a lot, but it doesn't heat next to it, it heats above. Super helpful. Now I'm back in the room. The exceptional moment for involuntary psychiatric intervention is when an individual is considered to be a threat to their own life or the life of others, a threat that which the patient is themselves unaware of and therefore is necessary as to protect the individual from themselves. Here, the patient's agency is suspended, as they are considered to be lacking in reason, that is, the capacity to discern good from bad and to be in control of their behavior. In the introduction of The Suicide, Durkheim formulates definitively that we call suicide any case of death resulting directly or indirectly from a positive or negative act performed by the victim themselves and which they knew would produce this result. This definition is considered by Bourdieu et Establé in Durkheim and Suicide to be both theoretically impeccable and impractical. For under what basis can one claim that the private reason, unverifiable intention, of suicide coincides with its public and statistical definition, knowledge of one's actions as suicidal? This incommensurability puts to question what it is that legitimizes an involuntary psychiatric intervention that strips the accused victim of all personal agency. For if the intervention occurs when a victim is deemed to be a threat to themselves without knowing it, how can, by Durkheim's definition, where the victim needs to have the awareness of the result of their suicidal act, even be considered suicidal? Here we realize that what requires closer examination is the operational definitions used in psychiatry, i.e. the concept of schizophrenia that a psychiatrist refers to justify a corresponding diagnosis. In the Conference of Hempel, Karl Hempel argues that the theoretical terms of psychiatry have neglected the descriptive stage and moved straight onto the theoretical. The danger is to use theoretical language that is not scientifically sound. This critique puts to question the reliability and objectivity of the theoretical language that is the basis of psychiatry, as it runs the risk of subjecting the biopsychosocial being to an illegitimate, unreasonable, and essentialist conception of what it means to function in society. According to Satz, a Hungarian-American psychiatrist, the problem lies in the institutionalized denial of the tragic nature of life. The essentialist conception of non-functioning is therefore simply an individual who is incapable to function, i.e. as a symptom, while neglecting entirely how it is that the individual arrives at manifesting this incapacity, i.e. its cause. In what is DSM, Dehumanizes recounts such as he declared that the term mental illness is a semantic strategy of medicalizing economic, moral, personal, political, and social problems. This disease-mongering is the social process through which a condition, in this case human suffering, is seen as a disease that can be resolved through medication, a straw man that obscures the necessity of social reform. Such goes further by qualifying the difference between good and bad behavior. Good behavior, that which is attributed by society, is naturally attributed to personal merit or initiative. Most bad behavior, alcoholism, aggression, violence, murder, pedophilia, etc., on the other hand, is interpreted as a mental disorder that affects the individual and takes away all or part of his or her responsibility. In other words, when one acts in an acceptable way, one is considered valuable in society, fully in capacity of one's reason, and whose actions are a positive attribute and proof of one's good use of reason. Good. On the other hand, when one behaves badly, one's actions are medicalized, and these actions are attributed to the individual's lack of reason and is that which legitimizes the suspension of their responsibility and, by extension, their agency. We have highlighted two major problems with psychiatry. Firstly, its questionable foundations as an inexact science, and secondly, its denial of human suffering that puts to question not only its capacity to treat human suffering, but to reliably and objectively identify it. However, despite its fallible foundations and operations, psychiatry is still considered a figure of authority in modern society. Said differently, the illegitimate, essentialist nature of psychiatry produces nonetheless legitimate and concrete repercussions in the lives of every individual in society. For an individual who undergoes the process of being clinically diagnosed experiences, as a consequence, a change in their social status and value in society. Part 3. What are the consequences of being clinically diagnosed? What does it mean to go from person to patient? The first consequence has been developed over its different enumerations. From the exceptional point of intervention of psychiatry, a person is no longer considered incapacity of their reason, and this estimation legitimizes the suspension of their agency. This state of non-agency is reminiscent of Aristotle's definition of a slave. In Nicomachean, in Ethique à Nicomaque, a slave is defined as one that is not in possession of complete reason. Inversely, he who possesses the full capacity of his reason is a man. In this way, a slave is by definition dependent, as they require the guidance of another to compensate for this inherent lack. This analogy is to highlight how a temporary suspension of the agency of an individual could in fact eventually lead to the permanent dependence or slavery. In Being Mentally Ill, Schegg introduces the concept called labeling theory. This theory considers mental disorders as stereotypes or cultural constructs that lock the individual into a role from which he or she then has a great difficulty extricating themselves. In other words, once a patient identifies with their diagnosis as labeled by a psychiatrist and by extension society, the patient adopts the sick role. This role is created when a temporary deviance. How do you pronounce this in English? Deviance. Oh my god. Let's try this again. This role is created when a temporary deviance is stabilized as a chronic mental illness. In Bourdieuian terms, again, misspelling, once labeled a patient, one is subjected to a different set of rules from the market as one's level of acceptance and therefore one's social stature has changed. In this sick role, one is rewarded when one plays the stereotype expected of them and punished if they refuse to play along. The mentally ill person learns, interprets the role assigned to them, and tries to conform to the expectations his role demands of him. In other words, a patient's level of acceptability will never exceed that of a patient, as they have lost their social value as accorded to a normal person, and as such reaps no rewards from the market that no longer recognizes them as such. The abstract power of the label, or clinical diagnosis, is therefore more than real. It's perpetual. For being eternal, it outlasts all of which it does not take into account, that is, the concrete, temporality, and the becoming of existence. In his postscriptum, Kierkegaard warns, if we now want to admit that abstract thought is the highest thing there is, it follows that science and thinkers proudly forsake existence and leaves us, amongst other men, with the worst to bear. Here, a second parallel to Aristotle's conception of the slave can be made, one in relation to his conception of human happiness. In Ethique à Nicomaque, human happiness consists of our ability to live a life of action accompanied by reason. In this way, Aristotle's slave is not entitled to human happiness due to their innate lack of complete reason and dependence on a master. In the case of being labeled, a patient is stripped of their reason, their agency, and as a consequence is rendered dependent. Therefore, does the patient not arrive at the same denial of happiness as the slave once they have undergone the labeling process of a clinical diagnosis? Taken a step further, if those who wish to avoid being labeled chooses to avoid all behaviors that deviate from the norm, i.e., to only perform good behaviors, can we truly say that any person is truly free to make and be responsible for their choices? Said differently, with the collective fear of being considered its patient, is psychiatry an institution that not only legitimizes the norm, but enforces it? This imposed fixity of a recognized norm, one that penalizes any manifestation of its deviation or mutation, impedes on the fundamental human right to choose. As neo-Aristotelian Nussbaum puts it in Human Functioning and Social Justice, the essentialist is failing to respect the right of people to choose a plan of life according to their own light, determining what is most central and what is not. Fundamentally, the enforcement of the essentialist and abstract norm by psychiatry is precisely what threatens human agency. Under the threat of losing our agency, the only choice left to the individual is one that is determined by another in advance. In this way, no individual is autonomous in determining their own life, or to put it bluntly, in society, everyone's a slave, labeled or otherwise. In Violence, Zizek confronts this pseudo-freedom. What is this famous freedom with responsibility, if not a new version of the good old paradox of forced choice? You're given freedom of choice on the condition that you make the right choice. You're given freedom on the condition that you will not really use it. In other words, those who are given freedom are only afforded the stature of value of person on the condition that they do not prove themselves to be otherwise. One is free on the condition that one behaves like a normal person who makes good choices, right choices, that benefits and adheres to the norm and order of society. We have identified the great mutations that an individual undergoes when adapting into society. We have highlighted the unreliable and unobjective nature of the inexact science that is psychiatry, a nature that does not prevent it from substantializing real and perpetual consequences for those who fall under its care. Finally, we have brought forward the pervasive influences of this practice that not only legitimizes the norms of society, but upholds them with a callous disregard for human suffering. Yet, how are we to define this human suffering when conceptions such as sacrifice, work, and social conditioning all seem to have fallen short? Perhaps we might content ourselves with its negative definition, one that does not inherently possess a positive existence in reality, but one that comes into existence through a completely external and separate act. Human suffering, therefore, emerges from the dehumanizing process of clinical diagnosis, through the reification of the psychiatric patient, an embodiment of human suffering, as an individual defined by their total lack of agency and denial of human happiness. I hope that was helpful. I will include a link to a bilingual version at the bottom if you'd like to read it for yourself and look at the sources, because I cite them all below exactly where I found them. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you for your time.